Today at 8:52 in the morning, Donald Trump said he wants the Panama Canal back. 5 words that were heard at the same time in Panama City, in Ottawa, in Brussels, in Tokyo, and in every government office around the world that watches what America does and tries to figure out what it means for their own country's independence. 5 words that reminded people of a time in history when big countries took things from small countries. A time that the world order built after World War II was specifically created to stop from happening again. 5 words that Canada answered with 5 words of their own, before Washington had even finished trying to explain the legal reasons for a demand that has no legal reasons in any agreement the United States has signed, approved, or recognized since 1999. This is not 1900. And the answer Canada built around those 5 words has changed the worldwide conversation about how America acts in ways that will last much longer than this trade war, for many decades to come. I want to explain something before we go into the details of what happened today that most news coverage of this story is not talking about properly. The Panama Canal demand is not just a foreign policy challenge that has nothing to do with the Canada-US trade fight. It is the same way of thinking being used in a different part of the world. The way of thinking that says American strategic needs are more important than the rights of smaller countries to control their own land. The way of thinking that says treaties signed by earlier American governments can be changed by any future president who decides the original agreement no longer helps American interests. The way of thinking that says the international order built after 1945 to stop powerful countries from simply taking what they want from weaker ones is a rule that applies to other countries, but not to the United States. Canada has been fighting that way of thinking for 6 months in the area of trade. This morning, the same way of thinking was used on a waterway in Central America. And Canada's response was not just a statement about trade between 2 countries. It was an independent democratic country naming that way of thinking publicly, historically, and with enough exactness that every government watching understood exactly what was being said, and exactly why it mattered for every treaty, every agreement, and every promise the United States has ever made to any country on Earth. What Trump demanded. At 8:52 this morning, the White House put out a statement through the National Security Council talking about what it called a strategic rethinking of American interests in the Panama Canal zone. The statement said the president had told the State Department and the Department of Defense to start formal talks with the government of Panama to get back operational control over the Panama Canal for the United States government. It described the canal as a very important American strategic property whose management by a foreign government created unacceptable dangers in American global shipping and military ability to move forces around the world. It mentioned Chinese business presence in Panamanian port facilities next to the canal as a national security reason for America taking back operational authority. And it described the 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties, under which the United States gave canal control to Panama, as having been negotiated under conditions that no longer reflected current strategic realities. The legal basis of the demand was immediately and completely challenged by every international law expert who looked at the statement within the first hour after it came out. The Torrijos-Carter treaties are binding international legal agreements approved by the United States Senate. They establish the permanent neutrality of the Panama Canal under Panamanian control, and provided for American rights of defense and quick passage that have been used without interruption since the transfer of control in 1999. The treaties contain no section for America taking back operational control. They contain no ending date, making Panamanian control conditional on continued American happiness with Panamanian management, and they were approved through the full constitutional process of American treaty making, making them binding on every future American government under American domestic law, as well as international law. The Chinese business presence reasons mentioned in the statement referred to the operations of Hutchison Port Holdings, a Hong Kong-based company in port facilities at Balboa and Cristobal, at the Pacific and Atlantic entrances to the canal, respectively. American security worries about Chinese-connected business presence near strategic infrastructure are real and have been the subject of ongoing diplomatic and security discussions. They do not make up a legal basis for demanding control over a waterway that has been under Panamanian governance for 26 years, through a process the United States itself designed, negotiated, and approved. Panama's immediate response was exactly what the 1977 treaty framework allowed it to be. The Panamanian government put out a statement through its foreign ministry, rejecting the American demand completely and clearly, and restating Panamanian control over the canal as a permanent and non-negotiable feature of Panamanian national identity and territorial wholeness. The statement mentioned the treaty framework. It mentioned 26 years of Panamanian management that had maintained and expanded canal capacity while improving how well it works beyond the levels achieved during American administration. And it invited the international community to notice that the United States was demanding the return of territory it had voluntarily transferred under a binding treaty commitment, as if that commitment carried no more weight than a preference that could be changed when circumstances changed. Why Canada responded. Canada's decision to respond publicly to the Panama Canal demand requires explanation because the demand was directed at Panama rather than Canada. Canada has no direct land or treaty interest in the Panama Canal's governance arrangements. Canada's response was not legally required by any existing commitment. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated, independent choice to use Canada's voice. Canada's believability built through 6 months of principled resistance to American overreach, and Canada's standing in the international community as the democratic country that has most publicly and most consistently named the way of thinking underlying American conduct throughout this fight. Carney made that choice because the Panama Canal demand and the Canada trade fight share a basic way of thinking that requires naming from a position of believability, rather than simply from the position of the immediately affected party. Panama can and did reject the demand on its own behalf, but Panama's rejection, however legally and morally correct, is the rejection of a small country responding to a powerful one's overreach. That rejection carries the weight of legal argument and independent dignity. It does not carry the weight of a sustained, principled resistance that has already shown through 6 months of real evidence that the way of thinking being rejected is wrong, not just morally, but practically. Canada's rejection carries that additional weight, and Carney knew it, so he used it. Stay with us before we hear what Carney said, and why his 5 words have produced a response from the international community that Washington did not expect. Take 5 seconds, subscribe right now, turn on the notification bell, share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening to the international order beneath the headlines of this trade war. What Carney said this morning will be in diplomatic history textbooks. You need to be here for what comes after it. Subscribe, then let us get to Ottawa. What Carney said at 11:33 this morning. Mark Carney appeared before reporters in Ottawa. He had been watching the Panama Canal demand since it came across the wire at 8:52. He had spent the time in between in consultation with his foreign affairs team, with the Canadian ambassador to Panama, and with the leaders of several allied countries, whose responses to the demand he had been coordinating with before walking to the podium. When he appeared, he carried no document, no briefing notes, no prepared text visible on the podium surface. What he said had been put together in his mind over 3 hours of careful thought about how to say something that would be heard not just in Washington, and not just about Panama, but by every government that needed to understand what the demand represented for the international order they all live in. He said the following: Canada has observed the demand issued this morning by the United States government regarding the Panama Canal. Canada's response is direct and without qualification. This is not 1900. The time period in which powerful countries demanded control over other countries' territory, other countries' waterways, and other countries' strategic infrastructure, because their size gave them the right to make such demands, ended with the construction of the international order that both Canada and the United States participated in building after the Second World War. That order rests on basic principles: independent equality, treaty permanence, the rule of law in international relations, the principle that agreements made between countries bind future governments, regardless of whether those governments prefer the original terms. The Panama Canal was transferred to Panamanian control under a binding treaty approved by the American Senate in 1978. 26 years of Panamanian governance have made that control a reality in every operational, legal, and institutional sense. Demanding its return is not a strategic rethinking. It is a claim that treaty commitments made by democratic governments are reversible when the government that made them is replaced by one with different preferences. Canada rejects that claim, not because Canada has a land interest in the Panama Canal, but because Canada has a basic interest in a world where the treaty commitments of democratic governments mean what they say and bind the governments that make them permanently. Then he said the sentence that made the room go completely quiet. He said the following: "Every country that has ever accepted an American commitment as binding should today be asking the same question Canada has been asking for 6 months. What is an American commitment worth when the government that made it is replaced by one that considers its strategic interests more important than its treaty obligations?" Canada does not have an answer to that question that will reassure anyone. But Canada has a responsibility to ask it publicly, because the alternative is silence. And silence in the face of treaty rejection is not diplomacy. It is being part of the problem. Then he announced 3 specific actions Canada was taking in response to the demand. The first was Canada's formal co-sponsorship of an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, requested by Panama, to address what Panama's foreign minister had described as a threat to the treaty-based international order governing independent waterways. Canada's co-sponsorship gave the Security Council session request the backing of a G7 democracy with Security Council engagement rights that made Panama's request stronger beyond what a smaller country's independent application could achieve. The second was Canada's formal submission to the International Court of Justice of an advisory opinion request on the legal status of treaty commitments governing the transfer of control over strategic waterways under international law. The ICJ advisory opinion process allows countries to seek authoritative international legal guidance on questions of international law significance. Canada's submission asked the court to provide guidance on whether a country that voluntarily transferred control over territory under an approved treaty retains any legal basis for demanding that controls return, absent treaty sections providing for such return. The submission named no specific parties. It asked a general legal question, but every government reading it understood which specific situation had prompted the question. The third was Canada's convening of an emergency session of the Global Democratic Critical Mineral Alliance, the Democratic Nations Economic Sovereignty Alliance, and the Allied Economic Resilience Network simultaneously. All 3 multilateral institutions Canada had put together over the course of this trade fight were being called into joint session to address a single agenda item. The implications of treaty rejection demands for the institutional commitments that underpin the democratic international order that all 3 institutions were designed to protect. The international reaction. The international reaction to the Panama Canal demand and to Canada's 5-word response arrived from every direction simultaneously. Panama's foreign minister put out a statement thanking Canada for its co-sponsorship of the Security Council session request and describing Canada's 5-word response as the clearest and most historically accurate description of the demand's significance that any government had produced. France and Germany put out a joint statement supporting Canada's ICJ advisory opinion request and restating the permanence of treaty commitments as a basic principle of the European Union's engagement in international relations. Japan and South Korea put out individual statements expressing concern about the implications of treaty rejection demands for the broader structure of American alliance commitments in the Indo-Pacific. Australia put out a statement describing Canada's 5-word response as essential reading for every democratic government. The reaction from the Global South was significant and pointed. Many countries that have historical experience with more powerful countries making control demands over their territory put out statements supporting Canada's position and Panama's rejection. Several African Union member states put out a collective statement describing the Panama Canal demand as bringing back the way of thinking of the colonial era that the post-war international order was specifically built to prevent from happening again. The statement explicitly mentioned Canada's 5-word response as the appropriate historical framing. Financial markets processed the morning's developments with a global scope that reflected the political rather than simply economic significance of what had occurred. The US dollar fell against every major currency simultaneously in a broad-based decline that reflected the market's assessment of what treaty rejection demands mean for the dollar's reserve currency status, whose foundation rests substantially on trust in American institutional commitments. Canadian stocks rose as Canada's leadership role in the international response to the demand enhanced its standing as a reliable democratic partner across every dimension of its international economic relationships. Gold rose sharply as investors moved toward assets carrying no counterparty exposure to American institutional reliability. Emerging market government debt spreads widened as investors reassessed the political risk associated with closeness to American strategic interests. Inside Washington, the reaction was the specific kind of silence that follows a statement no prepared counterstory can address. The administration had prepared for Panama's rejection. It had prepared for European concern. It had not prepared for the five-word historical framing that Canada had given to the demand that transformed it from a strategic challenge into a statement about the distance between 1900 and the present that required every government on Earth to decide which side of that distance it stood on. What five words named today at 8:52 a.m., Donald Trump demanded the Panama Canal back. At 11:33 a.m., Mark Carney said five words that named what the demand was. This is not 1900, not a legal argument, not a diplomatic protest, not a policy counterproposal, a historical statement. A statement that placed the demand in its accurate historical context and invited every government on Earth to consider whether the context it described was one they were prepared to accept as the operating framework of 21st century international relations. Canada has been fighting the way of thinking that produced the Panama Canal demand for 6 months in the area of trade. It has fought it with counter-tariffs and legal filings and resource control frameworks and allied networks and clean energy standards and mineral coalitions. Every one of those responses was necessary and right, but none of them named the way of thinking itself with the historical clarity that five words delivered this morning in Ottawa. This is not 1900. The time period of powerful countries demanding control over other countries' territory ended. The institutions built to ensure it stayed ended were constructed with American participation in American leadership. The demand issued at 8:52 this morning asked the world to pretend that ending never happened. Canada said five words that refused the pretending, and the world that heard them is tonight deciding whether five words from Ottawa are enough to make the refusal stick. The answer to that question will define the international order that every country lives in for the generation ahead. Thank you for watching. If you are not yet subscribed, please subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening to the international order. We are on this story around the clock. We will see you in the next one.